In a shocking move, the United States has just slapped a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, igniting fears of a new and potentially devastating trade war. This follows the 2020 Trump-China trade deal that ended a 2-year period of escalating tariffs and restrictions. But now, with the EU considering its own tariffs against China and China vowing to retaliate, the question arises: has the West just started a second trade war? While leaders like the EU's von der Leyen have made it clear that a second trade war is not the intention, she also indicated that the EU will likely follow the US soon and introduce new tariffs to compensate for China's gigantic subsidies to strategic sectors like batteries, renewables, and electric vehicles. Even more worryingly for China, nations that should on paper be friendly towards it, like Brazil, which is part of the BRICS, and Thailand, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, have already followed the US and announced new tariffs on Chinese goods. But if China wants to essentially subsidize the energy transition in the rest of the world, why is that such a bad thing? Could it be that all of this is just political maneuvering to appear tough on China, while in reality nobody wants to repeat Trump's trade war? To answer these questions, I've dived into the latest research by economists and journalists and uncovered that it is not really Western and Chinese rivalry that will determine whether or not this will escalate into a trade war. What really matters is how China will choose to solve its economic crises at home. But to explain why, we first need to quickly recap how we got here. Essentially, I think there are 3 pieces of historical context that we need to understand if we want to find out whether or not we are on the brink of a second trade war. The first is China's so-called unfair rise as a manufacturing superpower. The second is the first US-China trade war that lasted from 2018 to 2020. And the third is China's recent economic slowdown and how it responded by increasingly subsidizing its industries. Okay, first, let's talk about China's unfair rise to become the manufacturing superpower that it is today. As I discussed in my longer video about why China's growth miracle is no longer working, China essentially followed the same growth model that nations like Japan and South Korea did before it, which is that it first transformed from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing-based economy, which allowed it to level up its technology. However, crucially, this transition was not just about opening up to the world, as China allowed its industries to develop with a lot of government support, while it had high tariffs and other restrictions in place to protect them from foreign competition. At the same time, the country got relatively good access to Western markets, which for a large part allowed it to get rich. This is something that Western powers agreed to at the time, not just for China, but for developing nations in general, because the consensus was that free trade was good, but that in order to develop, poor nations should be allowed to have some trade barriers in place against competition from industrialized nations so that their industries could develop. In fact, Western economists in the 1990s were so enamored with the benefits of this arrangement, in which the Chinese got rich, while Western consumers got cheap products and Western industry bosses got rich as well, that they tended to forget that while on average everyone benefits from free trade, there are still some groups that lose out a lot. In the case of China's development, the losers were mostly blue-collar workers in the American industrial heartland, that subsequently came to be known as the Rust Belt. Indeed, as this graph by IMD professor Richard Baldwin shows, manufacturing jobs in the USA nosedived while at the same time they grew a lot in China. This brings us to the second part of how we got here, the backlash, and the first US-China trade war. In response to these job losses, many of these blue-collar workers propelled Donald Trump to win the Republican primary and later the general election on an anti-free trade message, especially against China, stating rather subtly that we can't continue to allow China to our country because that's what they are doing. Where he was referring to their unfair trade policies like higher tariffs and other restrictions on US products that were still in place, even though China was now much richer than it used to be. Trump believed that this was causing the US to have a giant trade deficit with China and that it was largely responsible for deindustrialization in the United States. So when he got elected, Trump started the first US-China trade war by raising tariffs across the board on products ranging from steel to solar panels. Indeed, as you can see here in this graph from the Peterson Institute, tariffs from China on US products were initially quite a bit higher, and then as Trump started increasing them, China responded each time by raising them even higher, continuing for roughly 2 years until they signed a trade deal to ease some measures, but mostly just let tariffs as they were be as they were. Also note that here both countries left their tariffs against other countries roughly the same throughout this period. But did the Trump trade war work? Well, we cannot know for sure. US exports to China certainly seem to have slowed down compared to their previous trajectory. However, in spite of what Mr. Trump wanted, it actually seems like China decoupled more from the West than the other way around. For example, as you can see here in this graph, in 2002, China still relied over 50% on exports to the US, Japan and EU. But now that percentage has dropped to around 35% and has even been overtaken by exports to friendlier Asian nations that are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, this makes more sense if you take into account that China aimed to become less dependent on the West already before Trump was elected. They just did it in a more subtle way than Trump did, because rather than relying on tariffs, China decided to reduce its dependence on foreign imports by heavily subsidizing its own strategic sectors like cars and energy, when it introduced its Made in China 2025 program in 2015. Indeed, as this chart shows, the Chinese government spent billions on its emerging electric vehicle market from 2009 to 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and then significantly more in 2021 as its economy started to slow down. It did this through direct subsidies and more subtle sales tax exemptions, R&D expenditures, and government procurements. However, as you can see here, subsidies to Chinese electric vehicles got a big bump in 2021, which brings us to the final part of how we got to the second trade war, and that is China's economic slowdown. You see, in 2021, the financial collapse of China's Evergrande property group made clear that China's property bubble had finally burst. A property bubble that had helped China to continue to grow rapidly after the country got too big to rely on exports to the West alone. Along with the drag of COVID lockdowns, it was the bursting of this property bubble that made China's leaders realize they needed a different growth model. However, in spite of most Western and Chinese economists recommending that China should switch to promote their service sector and local consumption, China's leadership had different ideas and reverted back to its old model of pushing manufacturing by increasing subsidies massively. What's more, as you can see in this graph, the Chinese started ordering its state-run banks to start lending more and more to its factories, despite local Chinese demand for their goods going down. This is, I think, the most crucial recent development if you really want to understand why we might be on the brink of a second trade war. As I discussed in my video about China's slowdown, economies tend to grow by focusing first on agriculture, then on manufacturing, and then on services. The reason why countries need to make that final switch to services is because this is where, in a modern economy, almost all of the jobs will be. If you do not make that switch, you will end up with high unemployment, and perhaps even more importantly, your population will not earn enough to buy all of the manufactured goods that your increasingly efficient factories are producing. So what to do then with all of these manufactured goods that your own population cannot afford? Well, you can export them, of course. Sure, this model worked very well for China in the past. However, this old strategy cannot work right now because China's industries are just so incredibly massive now that just a slight increase in production that cannot be absorbed by the Chinese consumers themselves will result in a massive flood of cheap exports to the rest of the world. And indeed, this is exactly what we are seeing today. Chinese youth unemployment is very high. Chinese local demand has stagnated, and yet the state is now heavily encouraging more industrial production. The inevitable consequence is that cheap Chinese exports are now flooding the world. But hold on a minute, why is that a bad thing? If the Chinese government wants to subsidize electric vehicles, batteries and solar panels, it would effectively mean that the Chinese taxpayer subsidizes these goods for us, for the rest of the world. But if you think about it, if China wants to subsidize our energy transition, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't cheaper electric vehicles and energy products help solve the cost of living crisis that much of the world is still going through? Yes, it would. So then, why does the world reject more subsidized Chinese goods? Essentially, I've identified three main reasons why countries are imposing tariffs to stop the influx of cheap, subsidized Chinese goods. The first argument is that increased tariffs are needed to protect local jobs and profits, especially in the car industry. For example, some have made the case that Joe Biden has just introduced these new tariffs to win favor with potential working-class voters in Midwestern states like Michigan and Ohio, where a lot of cars are made. Similarly, many have argued that European car giants like French-Italian company Stellantis, Germany's Volkswagen and France's Renault are now in mortal danger due to China's dominance in the electric vehicle sector. China's threat to local profit and jobs could also explain why a host of developing nations ranging from Asian countries like Thailand to China's BRICS partner Brazil have already announced new tariffs against China. You see, given that China got rich by exporting to the rich world, countries like Brazil, Bangladesh, Vietnam and India are now looking to do the same. However, for that to work, they need the Chinese consumer to be able to afford their manufactured goods, and they do not need subsidized Chinese manufacturing, which will prevent them from leveling up their economies by moving into manufacturing. However, I do not think that this is now the main reason that Western countries are worried. Indeed, contrary to what you might have expected, Europe's car bosses have lobbied against the tariffs because they fear a Chinese retaliation. What's more, the American car industry has faced stiff competition many times, first from Europe, then from Japan, and then from Korea, and it never before felt the need to introduce 100% tariffs. So, could it be that, just as with the first trade war, Western countries are worried about their trade deficit with China? After all, if you run a trade deficit for too long, this could cause a currency crisis. Well, no, I don't think that this is what the West is really afraid about today. Given that the US-China trade deficit is at its lowest in years, and on the European side, while the EU's trade deficit with China has certainly grown, it currently is running a trade surplus with the rest of the world. So its trade deficit should not really be a big concern. Instead, I think the third argument, national security, is now the real reason why the West is afraid of cheap Chinese goods. After all, both Europe and the United States now consider China a systemic rival that has made it clear that it wants to displace the American order and now quietly supports a major war on the border of Europe. A rival that could turn into a true enemy if it ever decides to invade Taiwan, which the US is likely to protect. Now, as we've seen in Ukraine, if that happens, the West would be completely screwed if it completely depended on Chinese goods for its energy production, such as battery or solar panels. What's more, after several hacking incidents and reports of China installing backdoors into various of its export products, like Huawei phones, the West likely doesn't want to become completely dependent on Chinese electric vehicles, which are basically giant smartphones on wheels that could be operated remotely. I mean, just imagine that in case of a war over Taiwan, China suddenly shuts down 50% of cars driving around in the West. Finally, given that civilian factories like those for cars and electronics have historically often been transformed into military factories in case of a war, it would be a Chinese dream if it could get the West to deindustrialize as much as possible. As you can imagine, these are all national security scenarios that Western officials simply cannot risk. So, to sum up, China's policies of trying to return to a manufacturing-led economy has led to a flood of exports to the rest of the world. However, rather than welcoming this with open arms, the world feels threatened by it. Developing nations feel threatened by this because it blocks their development via the export-led growth model that China itself successfully used. And on the other hand, advanced Western nations feel threatened by it because they now view China as a geopolitical rival, and they've seen with Russia that it is very unwise to depend too much on a potentially hostile country. So now that we know how we got here and why the world feels so threatened by subsidized Chinese exports, I think we can now answer the main question of this video. Is this the start of a second trade war? Well, sadly, despite the fact that neither Chinese, American nor EU officials want a full-blown trade war, I still think it is likely that this will escalate further simply because China's leaders now seem committed to returning to its old growth model of manufacturing and export-based growth. However, because China is now so big, the world cannot absorb all of this excess Chinese production. The West does not want to depend on a potentially hostile country for crucial goods after its experience with Russia. This means that as its markets close, more and more Chinese manufactured goods will flood emerging markets. But while China had hoped BRICS and Belt and Road Initiative countries can take the place of the West and become the prime customer for Chinese industries, these countries are very unlikely to allow this because it robs them of a chance to get rich through manufacturing themselves. So unless the Chinese see the light and switch their growth strategy to a more sustainable model, I fear that it is likely that a second trade war is essentially what we are facing. Indeed, a first development has already been that China announced shortly after the new US tariffs that it would retaliate against Western chemical exports, and it would likely raise its own tariffs on Western cars to 25%. But how will the West respond to that? Well, I'll do my best to keep you up to date about almost all of the latest news. Now, without any ads to interrupt your viewing pleasure on the creator-owned streaming service Nebula. Indeed, as you may have noticed, I said almost all of the latest news because as a small creator I might occasionally miss some big events in the global economy, which is why I'm very happy to announce that I have joined a team of creators like Wendover, Real Life Lore and TLDR on Nebula's brand new news page, which ensures that you can easily stay up to date about the latest global news. After all, if you want to know what is going on in the world right now on YouTube, you either have to visit all of these channels manually, or you just have to trust that the YouTube algorithm will always just show you the most appropriate video. However, if you now log into Nebula and go to the news section, you will find videos on a page that has been handcrafted to reflect only the latest, most important news. The Nebula news page also allows you to get multiple quality videos about the same subject. For example, if you want to know more about the Chinese slowdown that is now potentially causing this second trade war, you can easily see here on Nebula News multiple videos about this subject by me, but also by creators like Wendover and TLDR. What's even more exciting is that Nebula News has exclusive shows like The War Room, produced by Real Life Lore, which summarizes all of the most important updates about actual wars that have happened in the last month. So if you are interested in staying up to date in a more convenient way that also happens to be ad-free and importantly supports me directly as a creator, then consider signing up to Nebula using my link at nebula.tv/moneymacro or the link in the description to get that Nebula annual plan for 40% off, which translates to just $2.50 per month.